So what do you think of the game? Well, you can imagine in a class, a large class, there's a lot more noise. So you have the privilege of watching this in a more simulated way and understand this a little better. So there's a lot here. It's a simulated product. We're not really producing anything. The only thing we were producing was essentially tennis balls that go from one bucket to the next. So every time a tennis ball goes from one bucket to the next, that's 1 unit of output that we created. And we have some sort of assembly line, and we were changing that assembly line and understand how that affected the number of balls, tennis balls that are produced from one bucket to the next. It's a production process, right? You have some inputs, you produce something, and you do something with those inputs, and you produce something. So let's begin by understanding. Let's begin with that simple example to try to understand production a little better. First, let's think about the inputs. What are the different inputs that the students were using to produce the number of balls in the second bucket? Well, one clear input is you need students, you need workers. So that was one input, the workers that you have. So these are their inputs. Then what else you have? You have tennis balls, right? But that was more of the production. Right? So we're going to keep tennis balls out since they are inputs in the first bucket and they become output in the last bucket. Let's keep it aside for now. You also have the buckets, right? The actual buckets were also an input in production. So if we account, you also have the time that it takes to pass one ball to the other ball. But if we say that time is really working hours, we essentially have two basic inputs in this production process. We have workers, we have the students, and we have the buckets. All right? Again, assuming that we're not counting the tennis balls because they cannot convert it into an output. So these are two really good classifications because as you turn out, in every round we were changing one of these inputs and maintaining the other inputs the same. You remember? One of these inputs that we would change is the number of workers. Every time and every round we were changing that. So in our game, this was a variable input. This was an input that in every round was different. The other one was the same. We kept that input the same. It was always the same number of buckets. So to use terminology of economics, we can call the workers the students, right, in the game, the variable input, and the buckets in the game was the fixed input. Now, does that have any analogy to the real world? Well, let's go back and think about the black dog example. He actually, in our talk with him, he actually himself specified that he does consider some of his inputs fixed and some of his inputs variable. So I'm going to let you hear from him, and then we're going to come back here and see if we can identify what he said.
Well, there's a lot of other costs that would be included in that. I mean, all the constant costs, you know, just keeping the lights on, paying the staff, all that sort of thing. We have, you know, try to keep like the wages. We try to aim at around 20%, a little lower if we can. But our wages are a little high because we can't be as efficient because of the setup of our building. But you have things that you aim at and just try to work with what you can. The labor is going to fluctuate with the number of sandwiches we sell. And that is easy to see from the day that we opened. We sell a lot more sandwiches now, and even in the small space we have, we've had to add more people just to serve that many more sandwiches during the day. So that is one of the costs that's going to change. The light bill, I would say, is a fixed cost. That's something that stays the same all the time. As far as producing the food, we started with 2 cooks on our serving line, and then we realized at a certain point if we added a 3rd cook that we would be able to produce the food faster and be able to move more people in and out. And so the 3rd cook was more efficient, but we can't add any more than that because there's not enough space. So that's sort of the maximum that we reached.
So he actually mentioned a lot of inputs, but one clear fixed input that he knows in his mind he has, that he's actually at capacity on that. The problem he has had too little of that is kitchen space. And the problem he's running is that you see that he just doesn't have a big enough kitchen to accommodate all the number of demand he has. So for him, a clear fixed input that he cannot change, that at least in his mind, is the kitchen. Now, what are some of the variable inputs he's had? Well, he mentioned, I think he mentioned the lighting and some of the workers and stuff. Well, let's focus first on that fixed input. Now, why can't he just change that? I mean, clearly this idea of fixed and variable is really fudgy because he could open another store. But the problem is that it will take time for him to open another store. And in fact, I don't know if you heard that, but in our discussion with him, he clearly said that he's been investigating and opening other locations, but it actually will take time to come up with the money, to get another loan. So it's not really fixed all the time, the kitchen. He could open another restaurant, or he could expand this building and build a bigger kitchen, but it is fixed, so for some time, it's gonna be fixed. So the determination of whether an input is fixed or variable seems like it's determined by the time period. So then we have to introduce time periods. So we're going to call, I'm going to do two terms here, long run, to the time period in which some inputs are fixed. So how long is that? It depends. If you have you're going to start a pizzeria and open get a 1 year rent on your location, you have to pay the rent no matter what. So during that time, the rent is a fixed input for you. The place is fixed. So if you rent a place a year, in the case of a Black Dog owner, I think for him, it has taken him 4 years to start thinking about expanding, right? So for him, expanding takes longer, so the long term will take longer. So how long is it? We don't really know. It depends. But we know that there is a period of time in which some of your inputs will be fixed. Now, we're going to call the short run in the time in which all inputs are variable. And clearly, workers is one input that is variable most of the time, because he could actually close his door, and if he doesn't open the store one day, he doesn't have to pay his workers, right? So he doesn't have to use them. And clearly, he actually said in a time that the more workers he hire, the more sandwiches he's going to be able to produce, right? So clearly, workers is a variable input. But at the same time, kitchen will become a variable input, kitchen space, if he has time to change it. So in the long run, essentially, all inputs are variable, and there's really no fixed inputs. So that is kind of the division we're going to make in terms of inputs. Now, a further kind of definition word for you is that economists tend to refer to variable inputs as labor, because those usually the input that change is the worker's labor. And they tend to refer to fixed inputs as capital, because capital we tend to associate it with plant, place, and machine. And those are things that take longer to expand, to get rid of, and to buy if you need to buy them. So it's just so you see that sometimes economists will use that language. They usually use capital as a fixed input and labor as a variable input. We try to refer to them with both things so you actually don't get confused, but just have it in your mind that sometimes you see that language.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.